So a beer run is where somebody goes into a liquor store and they grab a case of beer and they just walk out with it or they run out with it. And in detective world, at least in Mesa, you always start at beer runs. I was the nighttime beer run detective. If you can solve a beer run, you can solve a murder.
All right, Justin, welcome to Tales from the Shift. How are you doing today?
Great. Thanks a lot for having me. I appreciate it.
So why don't you start us out by just telling us basically how the job worked? What was the job?
So the homicide detective, it's basically a police officer, but it's a police officer that has a little bit more specialized training. So to become a homicide detective, you have to go through the Recruit Police Academy, be a police officer, do some kind of detecting before homicide, and then you have to test into the homicide. And it's one of those things where it's not a learn on the job type thing. You have to know a lot of skills, but you're going to learn a lot of skills at the same way. And you're using things that you used on the street as a regular uniform patrol officer that you're using in homicide. So it's kind of like a building block. It's kind of I don't call it the pinnacle, but I'm going to call it the pinnacle because I think it's the best kind of detective.
Okay. And so you were a normal police officer. How long did you do that for?
About 6 years. So I hired on with my department was the Mesa Police Department, a suburb outside of Phoenix. And at that time, we had about 480,000 citizens, and the department was about 800 sworn persons. And it grew since then. I did 6 years on patrol as a uniformed officer. 3 of those, I was a field training officer. So I would not only handle my beat, and do radio calls, 911 calls, traffic stops, but I'd also train new officers when they came out of the academy. And then in 2007, I tested for detective. And in detective world, at least in Mesa, you always start at beer runs. I was the nighttime beer run detective. And that's where you start because you get good at, if you can solve a beer run, you can solve a murder. So
Okay, I don't know what that means. What do you mean by solving a beer? What is a beer run?
So a beer run is where somebody goes into like a 7-Eleven, Circle K, a Wawa, wherever part of the country, like a liquor store, and they grab a case of beer and they just walk out with it or they run out with it. And then the clerks will call the police and say, hey, this guy just came in and he just stole a beer. We get video surveillance. We use the information that we have and you go through photos and you create photo lineups. So a photo lineup is usually 6 photographs. One of them is a person that you think it might be. And then the other 5 are photographs of people who look a lot like that person, and you show that to a witness or witnesses, and then they look at that and go, yeah, that's the guy. Kind of like we see in the movies, like, oh, that's the guy right there. And then that's not probable cause, meaning you can go arrest them just on that. But then you go follow up, you go to their house. And a lot of times I would knock on their door a couple weeks later, explain it. And I kind of shrug about. And I was like, well, I got you on video. The clerk picked you out. The Circle K or the liquor store is literally a block from your house. And they're like, yeah, I did it. Like, okay. And I write them a ticket. And I said, okay, here's your ticket. And, you can't do that. And you got to go to court and good luck to you. It's very benign, but you have to start in the beginning because you learn skills there as a detective, like making photo lineups, reviewing video surveillance, interviewing witnesses and victims to elicit descriptive information about other people, which you do as a patrol officer. But this is really enhanced because you have more time on your hands. You can actually sit down with them. If there's no video, sometimes I'd sit down and have them do a composite. I wouldn't draw it, but we had somebody that was a very good artist, a forensic artist, and I would ask the questions and then a forensic artist would draw them. And we try to use that photo to create our photo lineups or identify a suspect. So you start with that as a detective, and then that's kind of builds. It builds. And then for me, that built into violent crimes. I was the only nighttime detective for a while in my district. And one night a shooting came out and the patrol officers like, we need a detective out here now. I'm it. So I went out there and I started it and I started running with it. And then the robbery detectives came in later, but said, hey, you're doing good. Just keep going with it. You're doing fine. And that's when I fell in love with violent crimes. And then I kind of worked up and I went from there, from beer runs to robbery and then serial robbery. And then right around 2012, I tested for homicide, got accepted. And then I started my homicide portion and did that for the last 8 years of my career doing the homicide investigations.
Very, very interesting. So when you say beer run, it sounds like what you're saying is it's a pretty common type of theft, I guess that what you're saying, and that's why you have the nickname for beer run.
Yeah, it's basically a shoplift. The technical term is a shoplift because the store is open. If it's open and you steal something, it's a shoplift. If the store is closed and you steal something, it's a burglary. So yeah, it's a simple shoplift. It's a ticketable offense. Very rarely did I take people to jail unless they usually had warrants. Sometimes I would identify somebody and they had warrants for other things. So you would arrest them for the warrants for the other things, and then those detectives would talk to them about that. And then I would go in and say, "Oh, and by the way, did you steal beer from the Circle K, 3 weeks ago?" Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna give you a ticket.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
very
cool.
benign, but it's a starting point. It's where you
Yeah,
have to
no,
start.
you gotta cut your teeth somewhere, I guess, and at the same time, the people who have all the experience, they're probably like, "I don't wanna deal with going to some guy's house who stole a case of beer."
Exactly. It's not the
Yeah.
crime of the century, but it's a good learning tool for us.
Yeah. Yeah, very cool. And then you said then you went on to robberies and then serial robberies? Did I hear that
Mhm.
right?
Correct.
And so, basically, that was perhaps the burglaries themselves that you were talking about, and
No, so burglary is when someone breaks into your home and you're not there. Like people say it all the time, like, "Oh, I got robbed." Like if you're not in your home, you didn't get robbed. Robbery is using force or threatened use of physical force to take property from a person. Burglary would be like me not being home and somebody kicking my door in when I'm not here and stealing my stuff. That's a burglary.
okay.
So I was in the robbery, and serial robberies was this was in between the 2000 2012, and in Arizona we had a really big oxycontin problem. People were robbing stores for oxycontin, they were robbing pharmacies for oxycontin, and we found ourselves in the midst of having a lot of what we called robbery crews, where they were hitting multiple pharmacy stores and other places where they would sell Oxycontin. So we started this serial robbery squad because we were linking these things together. So we started figuring out that there were crews of people that were doing this. And I ended up getting on that squad, and it was a lot of work, but we went from working in your district to working citywide and sometimes even statewide because or within the county and even the state. Sometimes it go out of the state or out of our county, but mostly in our county. So we were dealing with Phoenix. We had a task force where we were just kind of trying to identify these crews and take them down.
Interesting, interesting. Okay, and so then after the robbery thing, you were able to get promoted and go into homicide. So before we get into all the things you did with that, if someone is listening to this and they say, "I want to do this so bad, I want to be a homicide," would you say the path you took is probably the path of least resistance? Is would you recommend this is how someone should do it? Just become a normal police officer and work your way up.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. You can't just hire on somewhere as a homicide detective. You have to go through the whole process, be an officer, be a detective. And violent crimes, so like robbery, aggravated assaults, those just flow right into homicides. That's how I even got into the homicide is right before the testing process. I wasn't even considering homicide, but I had an aggravated assault. Two gentlemen got into a fight on a rooftop of a parking garage, and one of them pushed the other one over. He ended up falling, hitting his head. He was still alive, and he identified who the suspect was. I was on call, so I got called out, and I started working the case. The victim went to the hospital. He was hurt really bad. So I identified, working the crime scene, working witnesses, doing photo lineups. Identified who the suspect was. About 3 o'clock in the morning, I get a phone call from the hospital, and they said, "Yeah, unfortunately, your victim just passed away." So I go, "Oh, okay, this is a homicide." So I called the homicide unit at 3 in the morning. I called their sergeant, and they kind of knew me because I had helped them out, and we have in police world, you live by your reputation. People, everybody knows your reputation is either a good officer, a good detective, or a bad officer, bad detective. So the sergeant knew me, and he goes, "Run with it. We'll see you at 6 in the morning." Because we don't come in until 6, so just run with it. So I did. They came in at 6, about 7 o'clock. I briefed them. They got breakfast burritos, because it was first thing in the morning for them, and I had been working all night. As like right before my briefing, I had a phone call from the undercover officers, and like, "Hey, we found a suspect. He's in custody. We're taking him to the interview rooms for you." So I kind of went in there, told them what I did, told them like, "Oh, by the way, he's in custody for you," and they were, "What do you mean you? Like you handled it?" And like, "I don't know if I'm ready for homicide. Like you just did it. Like you just did a homicide. It's just an aggravated assault where the victim unfortunately passes away." So then that's when I started kind of having a little bit of like, okay, maybe I can do this. So it's had that stigma of a homicide detective. Ooh, they're the cream of the crop. I can't. I'm not that good of a detective. So the next cycle, I tested and I got accepted in 2012, and then kind of went from there. So that is the best way is to go the violent crimes route. In the police world, there are some detectives that go kind of the drug route, where they do like the drug investigations and then they come to homicide. And that's a good way too. You don't have a lot of the violent crimes experience, but you have the drug experience, which sometimes the violent crime detectives don't have. So it was nice in our unit, we were about a 50-50. So I could go to the drug guys and ask them drug stuff, and they would be able to kind of educate me on how that drug on the drug world works. Whereas they would come to me too on the like the robbery side and the violent crime side and ask about that, and I could kind of educate them. So we would work together. So either one of those routes, but you have to be a detective and a good detective for a while with a proven track record before getting into the homicide unit.
Okay. And you said that you tested for homicide. What did that entail?
It was a written test and then a verbal test, like a verbal interview, where you take a test and then afterwards, whoever passes the test and they sit down and they say, "Hey, tell us about how many search warrants you've written. Tell us about this. Tell us about how your, the worst interview you've ever had. Tell us about if this happens, what would happen." Then they give you scenarios, like if it's happened legally, what can you do? And kind of like testing your knowledge. And you also had to submit what you thought was your best police report. You also submit that to them. And then they would also contact your peers in your former unit and they would ask their opinion of you. So not just you saying I'm awesome, they contact your the unit that you're in and your peers and say, "Hey, tell me about Justin, is he a team player? Is he just kind of he's out for himself, he just wants to be homicide and that's all he ever, works for." Because they're looking for a team player because you got to be a team player. It was a 9-person unit, and a lot of times it was all hands on deck, and you got to work well with others, and you've got to be be able to work together in a team.
Sure. And so what about pay? What were you paid as a homicide detective? I'm assuming it was a little more than when you were a police officer. How did that work?
So in Mesa, and some agencies don't do this, and Arizona's weird like that. Arizona, we don't very few agencies have different grades of detectives. Like New York and some of the bigger cities like Chicago, and I know that New York, they have detectives 1, 2, and 3. So basically like different grades of them where you get different pay. In Arizona, a detective is just a lateral from a police officer, meaning that I really don't get any extra pay. So when I went from police officer to detective, even beer run detective, there was no pay raise. Now I made more money because I worked the night shift more, and also I was on call more, so I was tied to my telephone. If people would call me all the time, so your incentive for pay comes from the money. Same thing with homicide. When I went from beer run robbery detective to homicide, I didn't get a pay increase. The only thing I got was I got standby. So every 3 weeks, you're on call for 7 days, 24 hours, you're on call. During that time period, they pay you standby pay because you have to be available 24 hours a day to answer your phone. So that was an incentive. And then also it was overtime. I got a lot of overtime. So I ended up making a lot more money than the average patrol officer, but I would work, 100, 200. I think the most I ever had was like 280 hours of overtime in a year. So you would work more overtime than you wanted.
When you were a normal police officer, you're saying the overtime availability wasn't as much as it was in homicide that was available to you?
Correct. They would usually just have like if you had to write paperwork, sometimes you'd work over. We worked 10-hour shifts, so sometimes you had to work over your 10-hour shift to get the paperwork done. If you had court outside of your duty hours, they would pay you overtime for that. And occasionally, if somebody called in sick and they needed a fill in, you could get an extra shift here and there. But it wasn't anything like robbery or homicide where you're more autonomous. You didn't really need approval for things either. Like if I'm working robbery and at the end of my shift, I get a phone call from a witness who says, "Hey, the guy that you're looking for, he just came home." It wasn't me going to my sergeant and saying, "Hey, can I get overtime? Are you guys going to authorize overtime for this?" It was you grab your partner, "Hey, we got to go." You grab your radio, grab your car, and you go because that's kind of the attitude of the detective is you're always on duty. You don't have that set time frames of your work schedule, unlike the patrol officer. So you definitely don't do it for the money. There's very few people who are like, "I'm in homicide because I'm gonna get rich." Very few do that.
So would you say that most people make the move not for the money, but maybe because it's more interesting than being in the regular role?
Yes, I think interesting and challenging. I think challenging. The people who are in homicide are typically very type A type people, very high strung people. There was a lot of arguments. There's a lot of, because we all thought we were right, right? So I did it for the challenge. I did my job I was glad to do it for the victims. But at the same time, my real underlying motivation was I wanted to see if I could do it. I remember when I first got into homicide, I hadn't had a baby death yet. We handled infant deaths, and you have to go to those autopsies. And everybody's like, "Oh, those are the worst. Those are the worst." And I had a young child at that time. I had a 2-year-old child at that time, and I always thought, like, "Am I going to be able to do this?" So the first baby death that came out when I was there for about 2 weeks in homicide, and a baby death came over the radio, and I ran to the sergeant's office, and I was like, "I'll take it." And he's like, "You're brand new." I'm like, "I'll take it. Give me someone else to do it. I want to do it." Because I didn't tell him this, but I wanted to do it to see if I could, to see if I can do this. And I did it, and it wasn't that bad. It was horrible, but then, like, this is not what everybody made it out to be. And then after a while, you just kind of get used to it. So a lot of people in those positions do it to challenge themselves to see what they can do. You get this huge, complex case, and it's a challenge. Like, okay, can I solve this? And that's kind of your personal motivation on it.
Yeah. I mean, I hate to be too macabre right now, but how many dead people do you think you had to see as a homicide detective in person throughout that entire period?
From the 8 years, a lot, because it wasn't just, we didn't just go out on homicides. It was any suspicious death, any baby death, officer involved shootings. So I would say at least a couple times a week we were going out, even if patrol said it looks a little suspicious. Mesa, Arizona, a little bit of background. Mesa, Arizona is a retirement community. We have a lot of retirement homes. So we have a lot of people from like Canada and other places that come down to Arizona where it's nice and warm during the wintertime, and they unfortunately pass away. And their doctors in Canada can't sign off on the death certificate. So we have to get our medical examiner involved to determine about the death. So a lot of times it's not suspicious, but it's an older person who may have died in their trailer in 120-degree heat, and they've sat there for a couple weeks, and there's a lot of decomposition. So when the patrol officers go in there, they're deceased, but I don't know why. I mean, it could be, and sometimes it is. Sometimes we go in there and we look and like we need a search warrant because there's a bullet hole in that person. We've had that, and like sometimes even we don't know. We have to wait till autopsy, but sometimes we'll go in there, and so I've seen a lot of dead people. I've seen a lot of death in different forms, if you will, with different levels of decomposition, and that you have to get used to. You can't be shy of death. You can't be shy of blood, horrible smells. That you have to just kind of
Yeah.
accept it.
Do you think that you think it's affected you in any way?
Absolutely, absolutely. I always knew when I hired onto the police department in 2001. I always knew I was going to do 20 years. After 20 years, you can collect your pension, and then go on from there. When I was a patrol officer, I was in what they called the peer support team, which was a volunteer position, and they're trained in critical incident. And we would go out when officers were involved in critical instances. Like if an officer is involved in a shooting, we don't do the investigation. We're there for the officer to make sure the officer gets involved or gets in contact with their family, make sure they're hydrated, make sure they get the help that they need while they're being interviewed and stuff like that. So I had been trained in what PTSD looks like and critical instances. And I started noticing, especially the last 2 years of my career, I really noticed a difference. I would get really emotional on like movies, commercials that were partially sad. I would just start crying, and my son was like, "Are you okay?" I'm like, "Oh, I'm just makes me sad," and it was affecting me. And I didn't increase like my alcohol content, and it didn't really affect my marriage. My wife is a police officer too, so we always had that in common where we could talk about it. But yes, it definitely affected me. Just I always said being around misery every day does get you. Because homicide, if you live, they're not calling the homicide unit. Like we're only going out if it's that person's worst possible day of their life. So yeah, it absolutely affected me. It absolutely affected me.
Yeah. You brought up pensions, so I want to go there real quick. We talked about pay, but I guess we might have left that a little too quick. Pensions are hugely important. There's so few of them going around these days. Would you say they're still fairly common with police departments?
No. No, not at all. So when I hired on, the pension was 20 years, and you could retire at any age. I was 45 when I retired. So, and I didn't really retire. I kind of did a lot of other things. But nowadays, you have to do at least 25, and you have to be like under the age of 55, or they penalize you You don't get medical. I get medical through the city, so I still have my medical through the Mesa Police Department. That was all part of when I hired in. But halfway through, like 10 years into my career, they started changing all that and making it the 25 years. You have to be over 55, and you didn't get medical when you're retired, which I never would have retired. I would have stayed on because or gone to other agencies or done something other than homicide, but I would have stayed on. But yeah, I was definitely I definitely got very lucky on when I hired on into the police department.
Okay. Okay, let's try and be a little lighthearted. Can you tell us a joke about police officers or police work? Do you have any inside joke you might tell?
Yes, and it comes from the old patrol days too, and I want to say this: I've been victimized. I've had my car broken into and had my stuff stolen, and it sucks, and it absolutely sucks. But so many people, when they would have their car stereo stolen or their favorite phone stolen from their car or their purse or somebody break into their house and take their TV and their computer, and they give us serial numbers and all this, we're not finding your property. 9% of the time, we don't find that property. I mean, occasionally we do. Like if you are burglarized and you have the serial number to your TV, give it to the police officers because we put it in a database. And there are times where even in homicide, we'll like say like, "Oh, that's weird that this guy's got 50 TVs in his garage." You know what I mean? Like that's not normal. And we'll start running the TVs, and they're all coming back as stolen from different places. But it's a rare thing. But sometimes you say, "Oh, this was stolen in 1984 from California." So that's kind of the inside thing. And you don't want to laugh because this is that person's worst day of their life. Someone broke into their car and stole their car stereo. And now they have to get that fixed. They got to get the window fixed. It's going to cost them money. And they're like, "Hey, can are you gonna find the person that stole my radio? And also so I can get restitution for my broken window?" And you're like, "Yeah, I'm gonna write a report and we'll see." It's not, I'm sorry. It's not, it's kind of one of those things where the cops will look at each other like, "Yeah, we'll look for him."
You remind me of, I don't know if you've seen The Big Lebowski, but you remind me of the scene in there where he's reporting his car stolen, and he says, "You're going to work on it," and then it's like, "Oh, we got him working in double shifts, to find your car." He's
I
laughing,
love that movie. He says like the tape. He's like, "And my favorite tape is in there." And they're like, "We'll put it in a report, and we'll look for that too." That's kind of the thing, but you can't say that to the person because that's their, like I said, that's their worst day. And like I said, I've been the victim of that, and it sucks, and it does. It makes you feel horrible. But yeah, it's one of those that's just the reality of police work that if you are
yeah,
the victim of that and you see the cops look at each other, they're not laughing at you. It's just they live in a reality world, and that's the reality of it. So
yeah. I've never been robbed or burgled or any of that, but I would imagine it would make you feel vulnerable. Like
yes.
someone has come into your personal area and had their way with, even though it's your things versus you, it's still, I could imagine it would affect somebody.
Yes. And even as a police officer, and that happened because my car got burglarized at my house when I was a police officer. And yes, it makes you vulnerable and it makes you feel kind of like weak. Like, why did I let that happen? Like I should have known better. Like I should have taken that stuff out of the car. Like there was no reason for me to leave that stuff in the car. You know what I mean? I left my charger in there and a couple of other things. And I think I had like a $20 bill or something. And I was like, it just makes you feel like you did something wrong. And you have like, and even as a cop, I'd have to like kind of unvictimize myself. I'm like, no, 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 no. I'm not the bad guy here. You know what I mean? Like all I did was all I did was park in my driveway. I did nothing wrong here. But yeah, being a victim, it does affect you. It sucks. It sucks.
Yeah. Do you think, air traffic controllers, we have a lot of ex-military. Would you say that's pretty common in your field also?
Yes, yes. Especially because I went in February of 2001. So especially like 5 to 10 years after I'd been in, when a lot of folks joined the military after 9/11 and then did their 2 to 6 year tours and then got out, they started coming to the police department. So not so much when I was there, when I first started, but when I was a field training officer, we were getting a lot of people that had a lot that were military experience. And then when I left, as the wars have gone down, we have a lot of veterans that are looking for jobs. So a lot of veterans started joining the Mesa Police Department at least.
Yeah. Okay. Now, and for air traffic controllers also being ex-military, profanities is pretty much nonstop. Is that pretty common would you say for police officers too?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of cursing, and It's kind of like the military where the more you curse, that shows how the longer you've been on the department. It's almost like that, like that rite of passage, even when I was in the Air Force, when you were a young guy, you didn't curse that much, but towards the end, you cursed all the time. And it showed the new guys that, you were the salty veteran that had been there for a while. And it's kind of the same way. You got the old timers that every other word out of their mouth is a curse word. Um,
Yeah.
it's a little bit different nowadays because when I was on the streets, we didn't wear the officer cameras. But nowadays, all of the officers are required to wear on officer cameras that record everything you say. So it's funny to talk to the officers when they're not on camera and they're just talking to another cop because it's profanity galore. And then you watch them when they're dealing with people and they're really good at turning it off. And there's not that much profanity. It's, sir, ma'am, I need you to do this. I need you to do that. I need you to do that. And then when you talk to them on person, it's every other word is the F word or something along those lines. So they're good at
Yeah.
turning it on and off.
Yeah. You reminded me of, I saw this, I actually think it was just a YouTube video, but it was some police officers and had pulled over a woman and she was with another woman. And it turned out that she had her dead children in the back of the car.
Yes,
And the
I've seen
police
that
saw,
one.
you've seen that, and I
Yes,
found that I found that video interesting because I was surprised at how much officers were having to help calm each other down,
yes,
and obviously there was a lot of profanities also that were being like, that really freaked out a lot of them clearly
yeah,
in that,
yes.
that scenario.
Yes, I remember that because remember there was because they were like unrolling it, like what's in here, and they were like pulling the blankets back, and when they finally saw what it was, yeah, those officers they lost it, like they straight up lost it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember watching that because I'm thinking, oh, dude, you don't want to know what's in there. Like I know what's in there, because I'm watching it on YouTube. It's easy to be an armchair quarterback and sit in the comfort of my living room and watch what they're going through. But they had
Yeah.
no idea, and you could tell when they finally saw what it was and identified it that it freaked them out. Like that was, yeah, that was
Yeah.
that's a good video to watch to get that understanding of what it's like to be a police officer or detective because you just don't know what you're getting into. You have no idea what simple traffic stop. Somebody has a cooler in the back of their car full of blankets. That's odd. Do you think it's going to be children, dead children rolled up in there? Nobody thinks that. Nobody
Right.
thinks so.
Right.
It's a good example of just how erratic and random police work can be.
Yeah, no, I thought it was good because it also showed the human side of being a police officer. That I remember one of them was bothered more because, like you said, he had a small child at home, so he had a young child. And now he's dealing with, so it was freaking him out even further. So most of the time we think of police, I mean, as a non-police officer, like, you guys have your shit together, whatever. You're gonna handle everything fine. But they're clearly freaked out,
Oh yeah.
which I did find interesting that it bothered them. So, all right, well, a little more lighthearted now. Let's talk about your coworkers.
Okay.
What was it like? We already talked about profanities, but besides that, what is it like in Homicide, or maybe even just prior to that in the robbery version of being a detective? What was it like with your peers working with them?
It's a weird dynamic because you are really close. You spend more time. I spent more time with my homicide partners than I did with my wife and my child sometimes. Just because, I mean, you're doing the longest I've ever worked was 40 hours straight without any kind of break. Yeah, we took a couple like safety naps in my car. I'd curl up in the back seat for 30 minutes with a blanket. I always carried a blanket and pillow in my work car, just to take a quick nap. But you spend a lot of time with them. And it's kind of a love hate relationship because you're all kind of alpha people. You're not trying to outdo each other, but you're competitive by nature. But at the same time, we're all working together and we have disagreements. And there were people that I just didn't agree with sometimes. Like they would say, hey, I think this probable cause to do this. And I would disagree. And it wasn't a violent disagreement or a hateful disagreement. It was, we would just disagree. And they'd be like, hey, I don't agree with you. And I'm like, okay. And I don't agree with you. And all right. And that was it. And then like, hey, are we going to go hit this and get it done? Yeah. We're going to go solve this murder. Let's go. So it's a weird dynamic where you spend a lot of time with them. So it's almost like a brotherly, sisterly relationship where you love them, but you hate them at the same time. You know what I mean? Like there's days that you just don't want to be around them, but there's days too, and then you're not around them and you're like, man, I miss hanging out with them kind of thing. So you spend so when you spend a lot of time with that, you really get to know the person and you really get to know the people, the good and the bad, all their bad habits, all my bad habits. Um, they all know those. So you really learn a lot about each other, about that human being. That's why a lot of times you have a really close knit units like that. They stay in contact. So I've been retired for 4 years. At least a dozen times a year, we all get together. My old squad. We golf together. We have lunches together. We still do Christmas parties together. I mean, we still text each other all the time. It's even if we're not seeing each other, it's just, and then we get together after a couple of months of not seeing each other, and it's like we never left. It's like we're gone for a weekend. It's a very tight knit kind of group.
Yeah. You sound like exactly like a paramedic gentleman that I interviewed, and said the exact same thing. And at first I was like, man, these paramedics are not making very much money. I don't know if I would want to do that. But then he went on to describe exactly what you just said, and so I came to the conclusion like, well, maybe that's worth the price of entry right there. Because so many people have trouble having friends, as they get older and whatever, people disappear, whatever. But to walk away with lifetime friends like that is, you can't even put a dollar figure on that, I don't think.
Yes. And that was when I had decided to retire, that was one of the things that held me back. It wasn't the money because I had already had ideas about other jobs I wanted to do. It wasn't doing the job. I honestly thought, I'm like, if I keep doing this job, I know my PTSD is going to get worse. I know it. And so I'm going to have to deal with that. But a big part of it was I don't want to leave the crew. You know what I mean? Like, it wasn't the homicides. Like, once I left, I didn't really care about, I wasn't calling all the time, like, oh, are there any homicides? Did I miss out on this? I was done with, when I left, it was perfect for me because I was done with police work. I was done with it. But I missed the camaraderie in the crew. I had to think about that hard because, like, once you leave, you're not in the crew anymore, and they're busy. So it's not going to be like, 'cause I'm going to be sitting around and saying, hey, let's go do something. And they're like, well, we got homicides to work. And I don't want to be. So it's like, so I had to make sure that I was truly ready to leave before I did it. Cause otherwise I was going to be miserable. But yeah, that's how tight of a knit. And it's almost weird. It's almost weird because it's like a love hate thing. It's like, man, that guy, I would never get along with that guy, but I love seeing him every year. I like arguing with him. He's fun to argue with.
Yeah. Very cool. All right. Says here you were a subject matter expert for some criminal justice textbooks. You want to talk about that?
Correct. But when I retired, I was retired for about a week, and I got a phone call from the county attorney's office. And they're like, hey, we heard you retired. You want to come over and be an investigator for our capital case division, which is a death penalty division. And I was like, no, I'm kind of out of law enforcement. And I'd done a death penalty case. So that's how they all kind of knew me. And I said, no, thank you. I really appreciate it. And then a week later, I got a call from the public defender's office in Arizona, in Maricopa County. And they're like, and they knew me too, because again, you live by your reputation. I had a reputation on both sides as being very by the book and very articulate. So they would like, hey, and then they even said, we heard you turn down the county attorney's capital investigator. Would you want to come over to the defense side and be a capital investigator? And I was like, no, I'm newly retired. Then I got a call from somebody who I used to work with in the Secret Service who said that they had a friend who was doing a subject matter expert writer for 2 new textbooks that were coming out in criminal justice. Would you be interested? And I said, now that sounds interesting. So what it was this company Learning Mate got hired to make 2 new textbooks on criminal justice, basically updating the editions. And they wanted somebody to make PowerPoints for them, and also like test questions and like scenario questions and things like that. And that's what got me in kind of the world of writing about law enforcement, because I had been a cop for 20 years and had actually done it. And now I was in a working group that consisted of highly educated people. And again, we argued, and I like them. They're great people. We just saw the world differently because they had master's degrees in criminal justice, but had never actually put handcuffs on somebody, and had never actually pointed a gun at somebody to make them do something and have that person go, what are you going to do? Shoot me? I'm not getting on the ground. You're going to have to shoot me. And you're like, and like, well, you just use verbal judo. I'm like, that's great. What if they just don't want to do it? Well, you use more verbal judo. Okay. That's not realistic. So it was really interesting to be in the world where we would come up with scenarios, and they would ask me for a scenario, and I'd come up with a real world scenario that I had dealt with myself. And then they would turn around and go, oh yeah, by textbook, that does not meet a definition of probable cause. You legally couldn't do that. I'm like, really? Because that dude's in prison for 55 years because that's the reality. You know what I mean? And that's kind of how the world is too. You have the textbook side of the world, and then you have the reality side of the world. And
Right.
that's when I really started kind of thinking like, it'd be really interesting if society and people knew more about the reality of how some of these complex crimes are solved. Because it's not all textbooks are great, but it's two different worlds in there. And then that really opened my eyes to it. And it was a lot of fun. Again, we had some spirited, heated debates, but we had some fun times because even I started seeing their side and not sides. I shouldn't say that. I started seeing that what their education was and said that that may be what your PhD says. But then I would say, have you ever pointed a gun at somebody or have you ever had somebody try to kill you with a knife? And like, no. I'm like, well, what would you do? Well, I would use my training and my tactics to throw them on the ground. How are you going to do that? You know what I mean? Like, what special tactics do you have in the academy? Did they teach you special tactics to stop somebody from stabbing you with a kitchen knife? They don't teach you that. They teach you basic stuff, and then you got to kind of figure the rest out on your own. So it's interesting to see how that dynamic worked. And I think with our working group of the different concepts and ideas and experience, I think it really did a good job in those textbooks because we're giving them kind of everything. Because we started showing them like this is the textbook way, this is what the Supreme Court and like the lawyers would say, and this is what street cops would say. You as a police officer are going to have to figure out how to mesh all three of those together and make them work in a real life scenario. And I think that, not to gloat, but I think we did a really good job making a good, accurate representation of what police work is like.
Yeah, that sounds pretty cool to put the practical portion into there. Hey, quick time out. I just want to say that if you'd like to come on the show, email me at talesfromtheshiftpodcast@gmail.com. And we'll talk about your shift. So you went from police officer, and then you did robbery detective, homicide detective. You went and worked on textbooks afterwards. What are some other paths that someone might take who made it to detective? What are some other moves they could make when they're done with that?
In the detective world, like in the police department, so like homicide detective is kind of the pinnacle, kind of the top of the tip of the spear on the violent crime side. Just like undercover narcotics detective is kind of the tip of the spear on the narcotics side. So once you go to homicide, most people I know, most people who go into homicide, they retire from homicide. Because once you do homicide, it's really hard to go back. Also, as a robbery detective or a beer run detective or a robbery detective or a burglary detective, you don't have the resources available to you that a homicide detective has. So if I had a burglary and I knew who the guy was, I'm not getting on the phone and calling the FBI and getting this and getting, super secret stuff and saying, I want a helicopter and I want a SWAT team and I want this and I want that. They're going to laugh at you. They're going to be like, awesome. What is it for? Burglary. They're gonna laugh at you and they're gonna hang up the phone. In homicide, I could literally do that. I could literally call my sergeant and say, I need the FBI. I need the FBI specialty stuff that we can't talk about. That's super secret. I need to get a hold of this. I even went through the military once and ended up calling OSI and ended up within 24 hours had a telephone interview from a soldier in Japan scheduled for me to interview. I mean, it was literally a phone call. And I could do that. I could call him up and I say, hey, I'm looking for OSI and I'm Mesa, I'm Detective Bocock from the Mesa Police Department. What is this regarding? I'm like, it's a homicide in Mesa and a service member from your department may be involved. Sir, stand by. Let me get you with the commanding officer. And I literally just talked to a colonel. He said, not a problem. He's like, can I just get a basics? I told him basics. He goes, I'll make it happen within 24 hours. Will you be available for a video call? I will, Colonel. Thank you for your, and if I did that for a burglary or, they stole beer when they were on leave, you know, no disrespect, sir, but we're not handling that. Like, we're going to tell them you can't go on leave anymore. So once you do that, it's hard to go anywhere else. You know what I mean? Because you're going to go places and be like, yeah, I can solve robberies. Let me call up my FBI friend. And be like, no, you're not getting FBI for that. So a lot of them would either retire or they would go, a lot of homicide detectives will go into internal affairs because internal affair investigations are usually very complex. They're usually not criminal, but they're very complex. And a lot of search warrants and paperwork and kind of putting a whole bunch of stuff together to try to figure things out. So a lot of them would kind of go into that way. Plus, they're high stress. Homicide investigations aren't just about solving the cases. It's also about the stress that's on it from the family, from society, from the news people. You got news people calling you every day. You got the public information officer calling you. Sometimes I've had the chief drop by every day, just knock on the door and say, how are we doing on that? Are we going to get a solve? And like, I'm on it, chief. That's a little bit of pressure. That's a little bit of pressure.
Yeah.
So same thing working internal affairs. You have some cases where you're involved, you're investigating your peers. So that could be a little bit of stress. I got asked twice to go to internal affairs and it wasn't my bag. It just wasn't my thing. I really enjoyed criminal cases and I didn't really want to do that. But that's where that would be the kind of progression for a homicide detective. And outside of the police department and law enforcement, most homicide detectives I know just straight up retired. They just didn't want to they didn't want to relive the homicides. They didn't want to talk about homicides. They didn't want to deal with death. They play golf. They travel. I take it back. My old partner, she retired a year before me. She went to nursing school and is now as a registered nurse working graveyard shift. So that's the route that she took. but most of them retire and play golf. That's what they do.
It's interesting because I can't think there's not too many jobs where you could call somebody on the phone or go to their house, I suppose, and they sit up like and you really get their attention just by saying who you are and what you do. Most people. So I guess that's kind of cool.
It is. Yeah. It was nice. And it was nice for the compliance. And same thing, just handing someone my business card, going to a store and saying, I need to see your video surveillance. And you say, you have a badge on and I'm dressed like this, and I have a badge and a gun on. And I'm like, hey, how you doing, sir? Do you have video surveillance? Yep. Can I see it? Nope. And you're like, all right. And usually I wouldn't try to push it. I'd always be very kind of subtle. I'd go, can I leave a business card with you? Yes. And I give him the bit, and it says right on there, homicide division. And he'd be like, "It's about a homicide?" Like, yeah. And then it's usually on the news. He's like, "It's about the homicide that happened last week." Yeah. Come on back. I'll get you that video. I'm like, you're like, you already looked at it. He's like, I already looked at it. And you can have, and usually ask them, did you anything good on there? Yeah. You're going to want this, and they're not calling the cops because that's what they are. But yes, you're right. You get that compliance from people just sometimes by showing up and, you know, Bocock homicide division. Yes, sir. What can I get you?
Yeah. Yeah. Is my pizza done yet or not? All right. What type of person would you say this job is definitely for or maybe not for?
It's definitely for somebody who wants to push themselves, who wants to see how far, not how far they can go, but just push themselves and see if they're going to be able to do it. Like I always wanted to see, every homicide, I'm like, can I solve it? Can I do this? Can I do that? It was a challenge for me. If you like challenges, then homicide detecting or detecting is definitely for you. If you're not kind of, if you're kind of more of just it'll all kind of work out, and I'll hang back and things will just kind of work out on their own. Detecting really isn't for you. But police officer maybe, because police officer's more reactive. You kind of have to you stand by, you wait for someone to call 911 and then you get dispatched to that call. But detectives, especially homicide detectives, always thinking outside of the box, always thinking about how we're going to solve the case and how we're going to not push the limits, but if this is how far I can go, but if I go just a little bit further, I might get what I need. How can I do that legally and explain that? So you're knowledgeable enough in the law and you're knowledgeable enough about what's going to be asked in court that you can kind of push those limits to get what you need for the case. Because it's all about the case. It's all about solving the homicides. Also, anybody who doesn't like long hours, don't be a detective. Be a patrol officer because you have your 10-hour shift and then you kind of go home. If you want to work over, you can. Detectives, we always joked. We had a guy in our major felon unit. So they were our undercover people that would go and apprehend our homicide suspects. They were kind of like an undercover SWAT team. So we would say, I have probable cause for murder. This is the guy. They would do the workup. They would find him. They would sit on his house for 3 weeks if they had to, doing surveillance. And then when they came out, they're the ones to do those high risk traffic stops that we all see on the TV where they barricade the car and there's shots fired and they do all the fun, exciting stuff while I sit in my office and wait to interview the guy. One of those guys was a former Navy SEAL. And he always said, when you're a Navy SEAL, if you don't like the cold, you're in the wrong business because everything about being a Navy SEAL is being cold. From the training to just everything. If you can't handle cold, then that's no place for you. And we were joking one time, and he was joking about homicide because we were like, because he'd see us and we were working a case, and we'd finally brief them on it, and he'd be like, "Bocock, how many hours you been up?" And I'm like, 38 hours. He's like, "How many monsters have you drank?" I'm like, 6. And he goes, homicide. He goes, homicide is like if you need sleep, homicide is not for you. He's like, that was his thing. He's like, if you don't like cold, don't be a SEAL. If you can't handle not sleeping, don't go to homicide. These guys, you never sleep. And like, we don't. Usually I sleep when I give the case to you to track them down. Because usually we would work it, get probable cause, get them to go hunt them. And that's when I'd go and I'd grab a couple hours in the backseat of my car because they'd have to go out. They got to get their plan together, do their thing. I trust them. They do it. I'm not a tactical guy. They do their stuff. Sit in I take a quick nap in the trunk of my car and then they call me. Hey, we got him. We're bringing him to the station. Like, all right. Like sleep out of my jacket back on and go to work.
Yeah,
So
a lot of
that's
caffeine.
kind of my long story answer of who should do it and who shouldn't do it. It's a lot of hours and you really are pushing yourself. You got to be smart, constantly thinking on your toes, and you got to kind of skirt the legal limits to get things done properly.
Can you expand on that a little bit? What do you mean by skirt the legal limits? I'm curious.
So, and it's not doing like things illegally, but it's like, for example, I had a case where I had a fingerprint. I had a guy, a known drug dealer, not somebody knocks on his door. He kind of opens the door a little bit. Well, then they try to push it all the way in and try to rob him. They play tug of war with the door. Guy on the outside fires through the door, hits the guy on the inside. He dies. The only real evidence I have is fingerprints on the doorknob, which there are none, and the casing. I have one fired casing. The Mesa Police Department had a crime lab, and they looked at that, and they basically saw that there's no fingerprints on there, no fingerprints, no DNA, which is not odd, which is not uncommon. When a gun goes off, all that heat and all the gases that will sometimes get rid of any kind of forensic evidence. So I started doing Googling, and I ended up finding this guy, and his name is Dr. James Bond, which that's first thing that popped into my mind. He worked for Scotland Yard in the New Scotland Yard in England. Well, he developed a process where he got a fish tank full of saline solution and 2 car batteries. He put a casing in there and electrified it. What it did is it rapidly progressed the corrosion of the brass on the casing and identified a latent fingerprint. They used that fingerprint to solve a crime. So I read this article, so I called Dr. James Bond in England. And he actually called me back. I take it back. I actually sent him an email and then he called me. He goes, "Can I call you?" I said, "Sure." He called me. He actually retired. He goes, "I retired." He goes, "I got that technology." He goes, "The technology works because I sold it to a company and they call it Sarah LT." And he goes, "I made a fortune off of selling it. So I retired and now I live in a fancy home in Scotland." I'm like, "Well, good for you, man." And he told me, if you have a batteries in a fish tank, you can recreate it yourself. And I was like, okay, I don't think I'm going to do that. I'll probably just hurt myself. So the only place that had a Sarah LT machine was a place in Canada. Nobody in America has actually done it yet. So I checked that projectile out of our evidence and I mailed it to Canada and had them do the processing. They found fingerprints on it. It came back here. Now, my job as a detective is to solve cases. It came back here and nobody wanted to touch it because, like, well, it went to Canada. How can we prove chain of custody? And I'm like, well, we all did the tape thing. We photographed it. When I put tape, so chain of custody is to prove that nobody had tampered with this. When I packaged it before I mailed it, I put tape all around every edge of the box and I put my initials and my ID number on every piece of tape where the tape and the box met. They did the same thing when they sent it back. And then when they got the box, they photographed it. When they opened it, they photographed it. There's all photographic evidence of all this. But that technically was not by the rules because they had never had rules about that before. So that's why I say when it was kind of skirting the limits. It's not that it was illegal or improper. Nobody had ever done it before. Since then, thanks to me, there is actually now a policy that says if you're going to mail it out, this is what you do, which is kind of like what I did. So when it went to the lawyers, same thing. They're like, well, how do we prove any of this? And I'm like, well, you put me on the stand and I'm going to explain it because I have photographs galore. You bring the person in here. It's, they'll explain the exact process. And Sarah LT wasn't proven in America yet. They're like, no agency had ever used it before in America. And I said, well, why don't we just prove it? Long story short, we actually use that technology. Now, Sarah LT, it's all over America because they ended up selling it because I did it and then a couple of other agencies did it and then they started becoming more of a proven process. So sometimes you have to push the limits to get that kind of technology in there and then it becomes technology that's more common. Just like back in the day, DNA was thought to be kind of junk science. And now we rely on DNA for everything. So that's what I mean by skirting the limits, or, because again, it wasn't illegal. It just had never been done before. And sometimes you have to be willing to do that, but you have to be willing to be able to explain that and not just be like, well, I just did it. You explain why you did it, how you follow the procedures of a normal custody exchange that we can explain to the judge, because they did try to fight it and a judge did review it and the judge said, yeah, yeah, chain of custody is good to go because they did all the things that they were, it's out of the limits. It's not what they normally did, but they documented it. So the odds of somebody getting in there and putting somebody else's fingerprints on there and then taping it all up and putting the signatures on there exactly how everybody was is highly, highly unlikely. And that's what the defense was trying to say. Well, the FedEx guy planted the evidence there. so, so
Right.
so that's what I mean by that. You have to be willing to kind of think outside of the box like that.
Okay. Yeah, that's pretty cool. Let me ask you this I'm curious about intuition and body language and such. Um, was there anything official in the training that you received on reading people, or is that something you just learned over time? Because I would imagine there would be many people that you would interview in the early stages of an investigation, and you would just think, well, this is definitely the guy, I just need more evidence on it or something like that. Why don't you tell us about that?
Absolutely. There is training on it, and they have it's a form of interview, like I think it's called like kinetic interviewing or kinesic interviewing. And they talk about if somebody's lying, they'll look up and to the left. If somebody, crosses their arms when you're talking to them, that means that they're lying or trying to hide things from you. And those can be good examples, but it's not always true. Because sometimes when I'm trying to recall something, I will look up and to the left. Or if I'm joking with other detectives, I'll look up to the left and they're like, oh, you're lying to me. Or somebody says, I swear to God, I'm telling you the truth. Some people just say that. So it's kind of a mix of both. And that's where the progression of being a police officer works up to being a detective. Because when you're a police officer, you're dealing with not hundreds, but dozens and dozens of people a day. And you can see the difference in people. So you know that some people, I'm going to be honest, some people are just weird. Some people don't make eye contact. Some people are withdrawn. Because when you're interviewing someone or talking to somebody as a police officer, you always have to consider their education level as well. Sometimes you talk to people and you think that they're being defiant. They just don't understand what you want. You get that a lot in sex crimes, where you will, as a patrol officer, if you have a sex assault and you're getting the initial information on that stuff, sometimes you have to use very crude statements because they don't know what a penis is. They call it something else. So you say that and they go, I don't know what that is. And you're thinking, what do you mean you don't know what that is? But you have to realize they may not know that you are dealing with people who have sixth grade educations all the way up to people who are PhDs. I've interviewed people who have talked way over me and I've had to stop them and say, I don't want to be that guy, but what does that word mean? I don't know what that word means. I had a guy use banantic once. He's like, well, the banantery that was going on. I'm like, I don't know what that means. I mean, I'm a dumb cop. What does that even mean? So you have to take all of that into place. Gut instinct and intuition alone really shouldn't be used because that's going to kind of bias you a little bit. That has to go along with your experience. You get that a lot on homicide scenes. We would get called out and the patrol officers would say, hey, we called you out because the husband's wife just committed suicide and he's not crying. He's not acting right. And you're like, okay, everybody handles death differently. And you're like, well, you talk to him? No. We don't want to talk to him because we think it's a homicide. Well, then you talk to him and you find out he's a combat veteran. And then you just ask straight up, combat veteran, have you lost friends? I've lost over 30 of my friends. That's why he's acting differently, because death is common to him. You know what I mean? Like he has regressed that feeling of being sad for death to where his wife is now deceased. He's just pushing it down and regressing it again. You know what I'm saying? So you have to keep that in mind. Like I would handle death of my family different than somebody else because I'm used to it. You know what I mean? Like I would know the people to call. I would say, okay, I'm going to call this person. I'm going to call this person. I'm going to get this going. I'm like, ooh, he's acting weird. I handled death every day for 8 years. That was my job. So that's why I'm saying you have to not go just off of that, but you can use that. The other thing is in law enforcement, and I talk about this in a couple of other situations as well, everybody lies to police. You have to figure out what they're lying about. There's so many people. I had an interview. I was talking to a guy about a homicide. And he lied when there, when this, when that wasn't my credit card, when this. And it's like, why are you lying? So long story short, I started thinking he's lying, but why is he lying? Come to find out, he wasn't involved, but he just kept lying. The thing was, he was having an extramarital affair, and he didn't want that to come out. So once that finally came out, he lawyered up, and I finally just called his lawyer and said, "Look, let's just meet." And his lawyer was there, he was there, and I just said, "Look, I found out. You're having an affair, you're hiring hookers. That's how your credit card ended up there. That's how you're on the video. Am I right?" And him and his lawyer look at each other, and he's like, "Yes, that's what I didn't want to tell you about. Can I not have that in the report?" I'm like, "That's all I needed to hear." But he didn't want to say that because he was trying not to get in trouble.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So I'm
Yeah, yeah.
thinking he's lying about the homicide. I'm like, "Oh, he's it. He wasn't." I knew. I'm like, he's lying about something, but I don't know what it is. So you got to do more research into him to see what that's about. So you got to take all of that into play. So it's not just one thing. And that's why you have to be kind of a seasoned officer and good at talking to people and have talked to a lot of people before you come to those types, like a homicide type unit, because it's not just about if they look up or anything like that. Those are cues. If you ask somebody a question, you would see a lot where you could get them engaged, where they were leaning in and, they were like, yeah. For example, there was a time I had a guy convinced I was lying to him, and I knew I had him convinced that I knew that he did the crime. It was a robbery. And I was like, well, because you were here and you drove the black car. And I know that your girlfriend drove that car. And he's like, yeah, what car was it? And I'm like, it was the black Jetta. And he's like, you think you know everything? He's like, what else? And then, and I knew all this stuff for fact. And I got greedy and I got overzealous and I let my ego went in and I just threw, and I don't know why I said it, but I threw out a color shirt. I'm like, and you were wearing the red shirt. And he went from this, he went, nah, you ain't got nothing on me. And I'm like, oh, I lost him. And even everybody who was watching the interview was like, you had him and you lost him. And I'm like, it was either because he always wore in his Facebook stuff, he always wore a red shirt or a black shirt. And I'm like, it's a 50-50 shot. And apparently I was wrong. You know what I mean? Apparently I was wrong. But you could see I had him. And as soon as I said that red shirt thing, yeah, that leaned, he was calm and cool. He was like, nah, you ain't got nothing on me, man. He's like, good try though. That was nice. I didn't do nothing. And then you got to start all the way from scratch and go from there. So you kind of pick up on those clues, but you can't just use them exclusively because you have to look at the motivation behind them.
Yeah. Have you ever had anybody say that they committed a crime, but you don't think that they committed the crime? So they were maybe trying to take the fall for somebody else?
I've never had that. No, I've never had that. It's usually the opposite. But I've never had anybody just falsely confess. No.
Okay. All right. What about, let's say someone has gotten promoted and now they're going to be a detective, maybe a homicide detective. Is there anything you would tell them that they should definitely do in this job or definitely not do in this job?
Yes. The advice that I never took from people when I first came on. When I first came on, like I think I gave the example earlier about how I volunteered for the baby death. And then after I started, every cool case that I heard come out on the radio, I was running to the sergeant and saying, "Can I have that?" Like, we have a triple homicide. Sarge, I want it. I want it. Like, all right, Bocock, if you want it so bad, it's yours. And I had a senior detective come to me my first couple years in homicide and say, "Hey, Bocock, just so you know, like this is a marathon and not a sprint. Like, you gotta, if you're gonna do this for a while, because the cases they build up. Because a homicide case, you get a homicide case, even if you solve it within even if you solve it in an hour or a couple of weeks, that's going to go on for 1 to 2 years before it ever goes to trial. I had a capital case, a death penalty case, and that went to trial 5 years after it occurred. So you're dealing with that case for all of those years. Well, while those years are going on, you're building up more homicide cases. So I was brand new and I didn't have a big caseload. And he told me, this is a marathon, not a sprint. He's like, just chill. All the things you want, you're going to get. Trust me, you're going to get the quadruple murders. You're going to get more murder than than your little heart desires at some point in time. And after about 4 to 5 years on, I remember we were having lunch one day and I looked at him and I said, I didn't listen to you at all. And you were 100% right. And he's like, I've said that to everybody and they never listen to me. But he goes, they're always right. That would be my advice. And I know you're not going to listen to it. The new detectives, you're not going to listen to me because you want to go out there and you want to light the world on fire. But it is It is a marathon, not a sprint. You'll get there. You'll get everything you want. Just relax, relax a little
It
bit.
it sounds like, you're it's almost IOUs of time that you're placing in the and you're putting them into the future, and you don't know when all those IOUs are gonna come due as to, you need to make phone calls about that case that happened a year ago. You need to submit a report about, and it just sort of ends up spiraling a little bit, and next thing you know, you're down the shitter with too much work.
Exactly. And it's always a joke of, when the handcuffs go on the suspect, patrol and staff go out there and they tell the public, we've got him in custody and, it's over. That's when the real work starts for detectives because you'll investigate that thing for years down the road. Because even if it goes to the county attorney, they want all kinds of follow up. They want, hey, can we get search warrants for this? Can we get search warrants for that? He's talking to people in jail. Can we talk to that? You want to talk to his family, his friends, and things. The defense will bring up stuff that now we have to investigate. So yeah, that's when the real work, and you'll work that case for years until it goes to trial. So, and it builds up, and you're right, it just builds up to the point where now you're working new cases, and you got a million cases, and you're in trial for another case, and it's like, oh, why didn't I listen? But no one ever
Yeah.
listens. No one ever listens, but they should.
All right. How about, can you tell us about the worst day that you ever had in the job, or perhaps the best day?
The worst day, there's a lot of worst days, but the one that always sticks out to me, one of the most emotional days I had is I had to tell it was a young wife, her husband, they'd been married for about 5 years, and he was a recovering heroin addict, and he had been clean and sober for several years. They were living with his mother and saving up money. He would get laptops and he'd buy them on like OfferUp and places like that, and he would refurbish them and then sell them to make extra money. But he was also a drug rehab counselor. Well, he didn't come home from work one day. So she calls the police and is like, he's done this before. He's been under a little bit of stress, and sometimes he'll just stay at his friend's house. I don't think he's on the drugs, but he'll stay at his friend's house and do that kind of stuff. And the officer was like, well, I'll write it up and then we'll put him in the system if he doesn't come home by morning. Well, by 4 o'clock in the morning, unfortunately, they found him deceased in a parking lot of a hotel. And that was my case. And so I went to her house at like 6 in the morning and kind of interviewed her on the guise of, hey, I'm a detective. This is where you don't hand the homicide card of a detective. And I'm gathering information because I'm trying to learn as much as I can about your husband. So I'm gathering this, and it's still kind of, she still has the idea that it was a missing persons type case. And then I said, can you call his mom? She might have some more information too. Let's have her here as well. She worked nearby. And then she started, when her mom was coming there, the wife started figuring it out. And my partner and I had to just tell her. And that was always heartbreaking for me just to see. She was a young gal and she sat Indian style on the floor with her cat that he gave her for their wedding. And I just sat there on the floor with her just to be with her. And that mom walked in and just looked into my eyes, and you could tell right away. She knew right away. And it was just like one of those things where that's just, you're like, this is the worst job in the absolute world. But we ended up catching them, and it ended up getting better. But the death notifications, those are the worst days. Those really are the worst days. And the best days are the days at sentencing, when the case is over and you're sitting in court and you've done all the work, you've done all the testimony, because we'll testify for days, sometimes weeks in trial, and it's sentencing time, and the judge sentences them to, I'm going to sentence you to 200 years in prison and this and that. You can kind of give that. I always called it the post conviction high, where you just walk to your car, just be like, this is why I do it. Like that great feeling I have inside. This is why we do our job. And then you just go to the next one and just keep doing it. So it's the smiles and the cries. It's the, worst day of the life to the best day where you're like, this is it. This is a great job.
Yeah, that's got to be rough telling a parent or a spouse. I just can't imagine.
Yeah, those are the worst.
Yeah. Um, let's talk about some more downer stuff. Any time in your career that you'd like to reveal, maybe you made any type of mistake or something embarrassing?
I made all kinds of mistakes. Made all kinds of mistakes. And in my book, there's actually multiples on there because I try to put, people are going to learn from your mistake. I learned more from my mistakes than I did from my successes, because when I screwed up, I'm like, I'm not doing that again, because that made me look like an idiot. And one of them was in robbery. I had just gone to robbery, and this one, and even this happened in like 2012 and all the way up until 2021, there were detectives who were involved in it who never let me live it down. So there was a robbery, and in the robbery, the guy was described as having two horn tattoos above his eyebrows, which you would think is not very prevalent, but there is a lot of people with horn tattoos. Well, it was in the area of this guy that we knew had been doing robberies, but we hadn't arrested him for the other robberies yet. It was the same. It was the same kind of motive. It was a shotgun. It was liquor stores. It was driving away in a black car. He lived in the general area. He had been in that store before. He had been contacted by police in that area. So I'm like, okay. And I'm like, I'm kind of like the old school police. Like, he might be good for this. It did the rookie mistake of going with the person and not the evidence to try to prove the crime, right? You use evidence to prove crime, not pick a person and then say, let me prove it's him. You got to let the evidence do the talking for you. So I made a photo lineup with the guy that I thought it was with the horn tattoos. And I found 5 other photographs with similar faces that also had horn tattoos. Like I said, it was actually really easier than I thought. I take it to the victim, and immediately he points to my guy and goes, "That's him right there." I'm like, "Are you sure?" He's like, "100%. No question. That's the guy right there." So I'm like, right on. It's like 2 o'clock in the morning. I call my MFU people, the major felon unit, the guys who I said were like undercover SWAT. I was like, "I'm sending you over a guy. I'm going to go home and get some sleep. Let me know what you think." But I said, "There's probable cause for robbery." Like, "Okay, man. Hey, not a problem. Cool. We'll get on it first thing in the morning. We'll get on this. We'll see what we can do to help you out." So I come home, I unwind, get some sleep. About 7 o'clock in the morning, the phone rings. I'm pop out of out of bed. I'm like, Bocock. I'm like, "Hey, like, got your guy." I'm like, "Right on, man." I'm like, "You guys are awesome. Let me get up and ready." He's like, "Oh no, you don't get ready." And I'm like, "Oh no." I'm thinking like they shot him or something bad happened. You know what I mean? Like, I'm like, "Oh no, what happened?" Like, "Oh no, yeah. Well, he's been in prison for the last 3 weeks. So, you still want us to go arrest him?" And I'm like, so I did all of this research. I never looked to see if he was in custody. He had been picked up on federal drug and weapon violation charges and had been and was basically in jail. So yeah. So after that, like I said, years after, I was briefing them on another case, and it was a homicide. I was in homicide at the time, and I was briefing it, and a lot of them were the same detectives. And I was briefing them, and they were kind of smart aleck about it, and were like, "Hey, Bocock, did you check the prison database?" And I was like, "Yeah." I was like, after that, I was like, "Yeah." After my little snafu on that, every single time I check to make sure they're not in custody, and I'll say that to people too when they go, "Yeah, I think this is our guy. You know, evidence shows him. His fingerprints are there. Yada yada yada." And I'll be, "Let's see if he's in custody," because I didn't do that once, and it will stick with me forever. So yeah, and that's one of those things where, they always say like you make one mistake and it follows you for decades. That was kind of my thing. Everybody was, you know, and no matter
Yeah.
how good I'd be, they'd be like, "Hey, Bocock, remember that time you sent us looking for the guy that was in prison?" Like, "Yeah, I remember. You're never gonna let me forget."
That's great. All right. If you could change anything about this industry or job, what might you change?
That's easy. The politics. You got to get the politics out of it, and not just external politics, but the internal politics. There's so much. There's kind of like a love-hate relationship between certain units. Like gangs sometimes won't like robbery because if there's a robbery and it involves a gang person, they want the case, and you're like, "But I'm already working it," kind of thing. So sometimes there's like that. It's
Mm,
like there's like an internal thing. If supervisors or even like, and not even like immediate supervisors like a sergeant or lieutenant, but like if deputy chiefs of a division don't like each other, sometimes they'll squabble with each other and that trickles down as well. So we're kind of fighting with each other. So you have the internal politics and then you have the external politics, especially the last 5 years of my career. We would get an officer involved shooting, and it was always, how can we get the community involved? Let's get community leaders to watch the interview of the suspect. We had one situation where an officer used force against a guy who was in a wheelchair, had one arm and one leg. But he pulled a gun. He legitimately he had a warrant for drug sales. And when the officer tried to arrest him, he was going to handcuff the one arm to the wheelchair, which is what we're trained. We've been trained in that. He reached behind his back and actually pulled out a silver 380 and pointed at the officer, and the officer shot him multiple times. Well, of course, you can imagine. I saw your face when we said shot a guy in a wheelchair with one arm and one leg. Even you're like, "No." So if and then that comes out, and then our staff is more, they're like, well, we got to get a picture of that gun and get it out immediately to the media. And it's like, you can do that all you want. They're gonna believe whatever they want. There's sometimes they were so preoccupied about what people were gonna say that they weren't just focusing on doing a good investigation. Like, let's just do a good investigation because it's gonna go to the county attorney and they'll make a determination on it anyway. We don't decide if a shoot is good or not. That's for lawyers to decide. Let's just do a good investigation, but we're tainting that investigation because you're trying to get all this information out to the people to try to convince them that we did a good thing, which people just aren't going to believe it anyway. That's just
Yeah.
society. That's just the way
Yeah.
it is. So if I could take that out where we just focused on doing our job, doing the best that we can to solve those cases and get a good case to a jury who can then give justice to those victims, that would be if I could change something like that, that's what it would be.
Okay. What about a hot take? Do you have anything that you believe that most detectives might disagree with?
Yeah. So there's two. Have you ever heard of Comstat? Okay. So Comstat basically is a method of policing that was designed in New York. And what they did is they started designing police, like where police were going to go and enforcement action by the number of crimes in an area. So, for instance, if there's a lot of burglaries in one area, you saturate that area with police officers and then burglaries go down. We switched over to that policy, to that method. It was really, really popular in like the 2007s, all the way up until now. The problem is before that, we were on a community, it's called a community policing model, where basically the police department, it knows it's successful when the community backs you. When the community says you're doing a good job, when your customer believes you're doing a good job, you have a good job. Comstat works. I watched it work because if we had a lot of robberies on one street, I would map it. I'd go to the briefings and I'd have officers saturate that area and robberies would go down. But you know where they would increase? Somewhere
Other
else.
areas?
Because the people who were doing the robberies would see cops everywhere and just say, hey, let's go over here and do our robberies over here. And it was more like street jump type robberies. So if you're walking down the street, somebody coming up to you, a mugging, they would call that a mugging. We call them street jumps in Arizona. We went to a full Comstat model. And the only problem with it is that I was seeing that we were solving a lot of crimes and we were getting a lot of arrests, but the customer was us because we would make a map and say there's a lot of burglaries in this area. We would saturate the area and we would stop burglaries or we would arrest somebody and then the burglars would go someplace else. And we'd be like, we are great. We'd pat ourselves on the back and go, we're amazing. But the community wasn't getting the buyback on it because the community didn't know anything about our little crime maps or anything like that. So they're like, you're not in my area anymore doing things. You're over here. So while we're focusing on one thing, crimes that we would normally be preventing were now rising again. So then we'd only wait until they rose to a certain level where there was a lot of dots on a map, and then we would go confront it. And I always said we need to mix those models because you only are going to be as good as if you get the buy-in from your community. If your community despises you or doesn't trust you, you're not going to get any kind of help from them in any way, shape, or form. If they are at least tolerant of you, which is how Mesa kind of was, like there was a certain segment that no matter what, we're going to hate us. But there's other people who were going to cooperate with us, especially if their neighborhood was being victimized. They'd be like, I absolutely hate the cops, but you might want to go check out apartment number 2 because that's the guy you're looking for. But you didn't hear that from me, but I still hate you. And you're like, I get it. You hate me. And 2, I didn't hear it from anybody. I got you. We're on the same page. I got you. But at least they're communicating with you. And that's what you need. And not a lot of people are like, oh no, Comstat works because it does. It works on paper and it does work. But I feel like the true customer is us. We were always so happy with ourselves of like, we solved so many crimes. But the citizens are calling in or you talk to people on the street and they're like, I don't see cops in my neighborhood anymore. I used to know the cop in my neighborhood and I don't know him. And that might also be because that's how I was when I was on the streets, when I was a patrol officer. We were under the community policing model and I had streets I drove down. I had citizens that I saw all the time that I knew I could stop and they would, be like, hey, what's going on, Jim? What's going on in the neighborhood? 2 doors down, that guy's got a stolen car in his backyard. I'm like, all right. Thank you very much, Jim. So I'd go and I'd do a little bit of research, call the detectives. Sure enough, they call me a couple days later. Yeah. We got to search more. And he did. Who knew he had a stolen car back there? Cool. I'm like, all right. And so police kind of got away from that. And I just think that and that may be, I'm just old school, but I think that that is something that we should get back to, is working more with the community. But you got to have the math in there too. But really, you got to work with the people.
Yeah. All right. Justin, tell us about, I see you got your book right there. What's it about?
So it's called On Call: Case Files from a Career in Homicide. And it is a case study on 13 homicide cases that I led or were intimately involved in. And they talk about, it's kind of a case study of how they start to how they finish. So it starts with, it's called On Call because every homicide starts with the patrol officers coming out to the scene and then the detective getting called out. When you're called on call, when you're basically on 24-hour call out. So I run the cases from the minute that I get called, usually at 2 in the morning. I don't know why. It's usually 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And what we're told at like an initial briefing, and then how the case unfolds. And I document each case almost like a police report, where it gives us the information as the information was received when we got it. So it's not like, my biggest complaint about some of these, my wife loves the true crime series, where they have a murder that happens and they talk about it in 15 minutes, where, a murder happens. And then they're like, oh, the police went to Jim's house and they arrested Jim. And this is the interview. And I'm thinking, how did you get to Jim? Like, you missed a whole section on there. So I kind of run down the process of how we get there. And I also talk about ideas or different concepts within each of the cases, like dying declarations, search warrants, how video surveillance is used, how we can't use hearsay, or we can use hearsay to charge somebody, but we can't use hearsay in court. So how do you do that? Co-defendant statements. If you and I commit a crime together, as a police officer, they can use both of that stuff to book us into jail. But when it goes to court, you and I can't testify against each other, because unless one of us has immunity, because you're breaking your right to remain silent and not incriminate yourself. So I talk about the intricacies of each one of those cases and then how it is resolved. Each one of the cases are resolved. So it goes from the call out and then it ends with the adjudication process. There's a lot of mistakes in there. I document a lot of my mistakes and I document a lot of my successes. And I do that I really wanted a true crime enthusiast to truly see how a homicide and a complex investigation unfolds. But also for people who are interested in being a detective, they can see kind of what processes go into it to get in there. Throughout the entire book, I also have things called call-outs, which are almost like textbook definitions, where they'll explain what robbery is, what hearsay is. It talks about, I give examples of how the medical examiner will classify a death of natural or unfounded and what each of those definitions mean, what felony murder is. So a lot of people hear felony murder on TV. So I'm hoping to educate the true crime, the true crime enthusiast, and also kind of be a force multiplier for the detectives, because there is no homicide school. Like, you notice when we were talking about how I became a homicide detective, there was never anything about, well, what school did you go to? I have a bachelor's degree in management, but that has nothing to do with homicide. You learn by experience and from your peers. So it's kind of a force multiplier, where if you live in an area that doesn't get a lot of homicides, you can learn from the homicides that I did and see my mistakes and also my failures and say, hey, you know what? He did this and that kind of worked out for him. Like, hey, you know what? This guy Bocock wrote a book and he did this, and we don't want to do that because it did not work out well for him at all. So don't do that. So it kind of goes for both sides. I know that my publisher, he really enjoyed it because he goes, so basically it's the manual for detectives that detectives never had. And I said, if we could make that a title, that would be exactly it. So it's kind of one of those things, but it's also not so jargony and written just for police officers, that anybody who's interested in how homicide investigations and complex investigations unfold, they can read that and kind of see how it goes through.
It sounds really cool. I'm really glad you said you'd give a free copy to everybody that's watching this video right now. But are you working on anything else, or is that the one you're gonna?
No, it just came out. So it just got released on September 5th. So I have been doing a lot of marketing for it. I've been working on some ideas for some new things, but they're rumbling around in my head. So yeah, I really enjoy the teaching aspect and the kind of, as you can see, I like to talk. And like the kind of the education and the talking and like the analyzing of things. So I kind of am working on some ideas in my head. So I do see some other projects like that in my future.
Yeah. I'm gonna assume it's not in your book, but are there any cases that you had while you were working that you were not able to solve that you think about today that maybe bother you in any way?
Yes, I ended up walking away. There's only about 3 cases I weren't able to solve. Um, and one of them, there's a warrant for his arrest. The suspect went to Mexico. I know who he is. There's a warrant, an international warrant for his arrest. He's just never been caught. And that was been years and years ago. But there's one that is still an active case, so I can't give a lot of information about it. But it was a liquor store robbery caught on video. 3 suspects used stolen rifles, and it really was bad for me because just they robbed the liquor store, they got the money, they took some cigarettes from behind the counter, and then on their way out, they just kind of decided to just shoot the 2 people in there. It's like there was no reason for them to really do that. They'd already gotten what they wanted. They were on their way out, and they just kind of turned. One person died, and one person survived. They were the surviving person had horrible wounds. This was a AR-15 rifle, but it was a 300 blackout round, which were new back then. This was like 2019 ish, and it just did a lot of damage. And again, I have an idea. I got evidence and I had an idea that it was these people. I was just never able to prove it. And that case was handed off to my successor, who he is since retired, and now it's off to another person. And I still check in every now and again to just see if they've gotten any breaks on that case. But that was one of those ones where I know it's there. The evidence is there. It's just a matter of finding it. And it's one of those ones where it's like it was for no reason. It was for no, not saying that murders are for a reason, but this one was just a it was like a murder that turned into a robbery almost. I just don't know why they did it. I don't know why they do any of them, but this one's particularly. So that one always kind of it'll be a good day when I get a call that one's solved. I'll be happy about that one. I'll be happy about that one.
Okay. I'm gonna assume this is probably in your book, but a case that maybe you're proud of solving.
Yes, it
Can you
is in my
tell us about
book,
anything?
a cold case. So every detective, just like I had said before, so when the detective retires, the new detective that takes their place in the homicide unit, they assume the cases that they have, either solved or unsolved. So every detective gets cold cases. Well, when I came in 2012, I inherited 13 cold cases from all my previous detectives. And I went back to the oldest one that I have, which was in 1980. It was a Super Bowl Sunday murder. And it's chapter 7 in my book. And it's called The Super Bowl Sunday Murder. And it was a 14-year-old girl who was raped and murdered on Super Bowl Sunday in 1980. And there was DNA. The thing is that it's 1980. They didn't know what DNA was back then. So a lot of the evidence was packaged with dirt. Dirt will actually degrade DNA. And in that case, I expand a lot about how DNA can be degraded and then how it can be enhanced and all that. And the lab did a lot of work. So I started working, and and again, in this case, there was a suspect that was identified. And also in 1980, they didn't have a lot of Mesa was a little smaller of a town back in 1980 because I talk about some of the older techniques they did, like they did hypnosis. They actually hired a hypnosis person to hypnotize witnesses to see if they could get information on and stuff. So they were trying, like they tried everything they possibly could. Come to find out that in 1986, when Arizona came up with a national database for registered sex offenders, there was a DNA hit on a person who had done serial sexual offenses and was in prison. But by the time I got that information, so they got that information and nobody had really worked with it. Well, when I started working with it, that person that was in custody was getting ready to get out of jail or prison for those previous sexual assaults. So we were on a timeline. So I started working that case and doing everything I could to try to resurrect it. I'm working that while I'm getting new homicides. So I kind of did it, and that was like my first 2 years of being on the department. And I'm more proud of it for it's all about selling. Is I had to kind of do a lot of work to get the evidence together, find a lot of these witnesses, get a lot of things together, present it to the county attorney, and they would give me a laundry list of things that they wanted done because it's a cold case. Make sure this person's alive. Make sure this is going on. Some of the witnesses who were eyewitnesses back then were older people in 1980 and had since passed. So we didn't have those witnesses. So we have to work with that. There's a lot of things going against us. And I just kept working. I finally convinced a lieutenant in our department, our homicide lieutenant, and he started helping out with kind of pushing people. And we kind of just kept pushing, and had there's like three. There were three briefings to the county attorney, and then it kind of goes from there. So it was one of those cases where when it did go, it was good. And then once we actually charged it, that's when the case really began. And I'll let the people read it to figure out what happens there. But that's when new evidence started coming forward, and I had all kinds of new evidence coming in, and it started spinning out. It's like once we charged him, we got more evidence, and the case just started just completely coming together in ways that we never thought was going to happen. And I'm more proud of that just because that little girl did not deserve that in 1980. And, we had to wait until, 2013, 2014 to get justice for her, but we did it. We kept on and we did it. And that's what I think homicide detectives, law enforcement should do is never forget, never quit, and keep going until we get justice for these people. So that's the one I'm the most proud of.
I'm curious about your opinion on the JonBenet Ramsey case. Do you have any opinion on that?
I've seen a lot of cases on that. And I think one of the biggest things that it comes to is the initial investigation. There was a lot of bias in that initial part of the investigation. It's from the documentaries that I've seen on it and the shows that I've seen on it, it seems like the detectives kind of did what I did with the guy with the horns on his eyebrows. They decided it was going to be him, and then they just basically found the evidence to make it him. And you can't do that as a professional investigator. As a professional detective, you have to let the evidence lead you. And I talk about that a lot in my book about bias. You've got to know when everybody's biased, but you got to know when you're biased. You got to accept that bias, and you got to move beyond that bias. And I feel like by them doing that in the beginning of the investigation, they may have missed crucial pieces of evidence that may have led them to other things. But yeah, you watch that, and that is a very convoluted. It's a very convoluted case that I think that was their biggest. That's as my critique of them. It's like they picked somebody in the beginning, and then that's what they stuck with. And when you do that, you lose valuable information from the initial crime scene because you're focused on something else, and you got to be very
Yeah.
careful with that.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. All right. Well, let's do the speed round. So this is the overrated, underrated section.
Okay.
Real simple. I'll say something. It's a couple of words. You say whether it's overrated or underrated. You can expand on it if you want, or we can just move on. It's up to you. All right. I got 10 things here. Here we go. You ready?
Right. Ready.
CSI/TV crime dramas.
They're so entertaining, but so inaccurate. So that's a tough one. Underrated.
All right. DNA evidence.
Okay, so underrated. Yeah, DNA is important. DNA is super important. So my other one I'm going to say overrated because I got confused there. I got confused.
Okay.
So CSI,
right, it's my fault.
Overrated,
I should probably
underrated.
I should probably define the rules a little better. All right. The first 48 hours.
The what?
The first 48-hour rule.
That is underrated.
Really?
That's true. Yes. The more you get in the first 48 hours, the better off you are. Just like I said with the JonBenet Ramsey thing, the more information you collect in those beginning parts of an investigation is huge because it's not being tainted by what media says, about people hear on the radio, on the news, on Facebook. Witnesses are all going to see stuff within the first 48 hours and start drawing their own conclusions and then telling you things that they think are fact that aren't fact. So the first 48 is huge. It's huge. That's why we don't sleep for that first part of the hour. You just keep going until you can't anymore.
Wow. Okay. How about stakeouts?
Oof. Overrated.
Right. Coffee and donuts.
Underrated. You got to have those.
I don't know why this is on here. Interrogation room mirrors.
Oh man, I wish we had those. Underrated.
You didn't have
we
those.
didn't have those. We had video. But I think those mirrors are going to be. I think those mirrors would be cool. Because they know, and it may even be they don't think they're being videotaped, and they should know they're being videotaped. But at least if there's a mirror, they know they're being watched. So but still, I think they're cool. It's very old school cop, and I think it'd be cool. I think that'd be cool.
All right, private investigators.
Oh man, they serve the purpose. I'm going to say underrated. Let's say underrated because they help.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
All right. Do they help? Has there been a situation where a private investigator has somehow helped with cases that you would have as a
Yeah.
homicide?
And yeah, because they could just kind of lead you. You can't always use what they get because it's not really admissible in court, but they can kind of get you out of a paradigm sometime. Sometimes. I had an individual who was a private investigator and an amateur detective kind of person, and he collected a bunch of news articles related to some crimes and brought it to me. And it was kind of like, you're kind of like, all right, he's really, and he's like, so because of this, this, and this, I think this guy did it. And you're like, you're really stretching here. But you know what? It opens my mind a little bit. And it may not be that guy, but you know what? I like how these different crimes are kind of related. Let me just take a look and see. And it didn't necessarily help a case, but it definitely opened the mind to where it's like, maybe we need to start looking at some other things. So I even thought maybe I just give him the case file and have him look at it and just kind of get his opinion. Cause like a fresh set of eyes sometimes is good to see it. Cause we get sometimes as detectives and sworn police officers, we get so focused with the rule and not getting in trouble and what the county attorney tells us to do that we're sometimes aren't thinking outside of the box because sometimes you do have to think outside of the box. And you're busy with other cases, you got a million things going on. So you just kind of almost cookie cuttering it. So when someone comes in and has a whole new idea, I always like that. And because it opens your mind to where you go, you know what? Okay, let me give this a shot because you never know. It might work out. So yeah, private detectives, underrated, underrated,
Okay. How about polygraph tests?
overrated,
Paperwork.
underrated, underrated. It sucks, but it's everything. It's everything. You're not putting in people don't go to prison for 100 years or get the death penalty without good, proper written reports. They are time consuming and you spend, and that's the other thing when you were talking about like who should do this job and who shouldn't do homicide detectives. If you like running and jumping, do patrol work. If you like sitting, because for every hour of field work, you're doing 10 hours of sitting at the computer and just typing and typing and typing and then typing some more. And then you got to type a search warrant and put all your probable cause in there. And those are 30, 40 pages of typing. And then you got to write a report for the county attorney and you're typing. So if you don't like typing, don't be a homicide detective. So
All right.
report, underrated,
All right. Last item, retirement.
completely underrated.
All right. And I have one last question. Well, actually, I have two more questions. This is from DA agent Brian, who I also interviewed on this show. And his question to you is, when you arrive at a crime scene, what is what are some of the first things you like to do?
Well, that's a great question. I like to take everything in and kind of get an idea because anybody who can go into a crime scene and say, like the movies, like they stood here and then they shot and the casings came over here and then they fell and then they crawled across the floor and they did this. You don't know that because there's a million different, because if you say that, I can say, or they were shot and the second person in the room drugged them across the floor. Oh, yeah, that could happen too. So I think the first thing I like to do after the initial photos are taken, I like to just kind of by myself walk through each room and just kind of get a sense of the house, sense everybody keeps their house differently. And if you can figure, like some people are very, very neat and meticulous, and some people are cluttery but not dirty, and some people are just dirty. And if you can kind of get a sense of the house, of what it is and how they maintain that house or how they live in that house, that might help you doing the crime scene. If someone's very, very meticulous, things aren't going to be out of place. So if something's out of place, that might be evidence. If they're messy but not dirty or cluttery but not dirty, something out of place may not be out of place. So I like to get kind of a sense for the people, and that gives me an idea of what we're going to collect as evidence and what I'm looking for evidence rather than just blood and all that. And if it's just like a hoarder house, I'm just sad because we have to go through everything. But yeah, that's the first thing is just kind of get a sense of who they are. And that will help me determine of like how we're going to conduct the crime scene.
Great answer. All right. Last question.
Okay.
Uh, and you answer this any way you want, but what's a secret that most people do not know about this career?
Just how emotional it is, just like we had talked about before. From the simple patrol officer to the sergeants, lieutenants, the chiefs, all the way to homicide detective, any rank in there, police don't usually deal with people on a good day. Very, very, very rarely do people call police because they're having a wonderful day and saying, "I'm having a wonderful day. Can I have a cop come by my house and have a cup of coffee with me?" It's usually the worst day of their life, whether someone in their families got murdered or their car stereo got stolen. It's the worst day of their life. And I think that people downgrade. That's why maybe cops, well, that's not maybe, that's why cops consider that when you say hi to a cop and maybe they ignore you, they deal in misery every single day. And it does wear on you. It absolutely wears on you. And it's the longer you do it, the harder it is. And we should be better at blowing it off. And when someone says hi to you, hi, good to see you. Drive carefully, put your seatbelt on. But sometimes you just came from a house where, somebody just abused their baby, and you're not thinking, and someone says hi to you and you're just in a zone and just like, I just need a cup of coffee and I just need to sit in my car for a couple minutes and just absorb this whole thing. So just keep that in mind. It's a very, very emotional job. And just keep that in mind when you're dealing with police, because they're just humans and they have to deal with, they deal in misery. It's always misery. So you get kind of a snippy cop, just think, maybe sorry you're having a bad day kind of thing. That might go a long way. I think that'd be my best advice on that.
Great answer. All right, Justin Bocock, author of On Call. Really glad you came on here. There it is. There's the close up. It sounds really cool. I like your book. All right, Justin, again, thanks a million for coming on the show, and I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you very much, sir. I appreciate your time.